Hey guys, first of all I acknowledge that it's well past Halloween at this point, but I'm still making my way through the Friday the 13th movies, so this year Horror Month is going to extend out into November. But I'm continuing my reviews of the Friday the 13th series with Friday the 13th Part 8. Jason Takes Manhattan. Now, this came out in 1989, and this, of course, is the 8th film in the Friday the 13th franchise. Now, I already reviewed this along with all the other Friday the 13th movies all the way back in 2011 for Season 1 of Horror Month. Those reviews are still up, however, they're no longer public. They're now marked as unlisted, but you can still see them on the Horror Month Season 1 playlist, which I will leave a link to in the description below, and I recently did new reviews of the first 7 Friday the 13th movies, which you can see on the playlist for Horror Month Season 13. Now, originally this was going to be more of a direct follow-up to Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood, where Tina Shepard, the main protagonist of Part 7, was supposed to come back in this one, but because Part 7 kind of underperformed, they didn't go that route. Now, this time around, the film was written and directed by Rob Hedden, who prior to this directed a few episodes of the Friday the 13th TV series, which, for those of you who don't know, in the late 80s, there actually was a Friday the 13th TV series that was technically only part of the franchise in name only. It had nothing to do with Jason. It was actually about an antique shop where they collected all these items that were cursed by the devil. But the show did have a lot of the same producers as the movies, like Frank Mancuso Jr., and from what I understand, Frank Mancuso Jr. liked Rob Hedden's work on the show and decided to give him the job at directing this one. Now, Rob Hedden would go on to write movies like Clockstoppers and The Condemned, and he wrote and directed the 2011 rom-com You May Not Kiss the Bride. Now, Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, is considered by most fans to be one of the worst films in the franchise, and is even considered in some circles to be one of the worst movies ever made. Now, I'll say this, even looking at this as a standalone movie, there's a lot about the film that makes no fucking sense whatsoever, but it also doesn't make a lot of sense in context of the rest of the franchise, because it definitely seems to retcon certain things. For example, in the original Friday the 13th, it was established that Jason was a deformed, mentally challenged child, which is why Pamela was a little more extra protective of him, which is why she kind of went crazy after he died. But in this movie, there's a flashback at the beginning of Jason drowning, and he looks perfectly normal. And in this movie, the main character is having hallucinations about Jason as a child, and in some of the hallucinations, he looks normal, but in some of them he actually does look deformed. Now, a way I think you can somewhat explain Jason looking normal in the flashback at the beginning is perhaps the person telling Jason's story doesn't realize that he was actually deformed, so that's how he's imagining Jason looked like as a child. But it seems like at the end of the day, Rob Hedden didn't really give two fucks about continuity, which is weird because the movie does arguably pick up where Part 7 left off. But a big thing with Friday the 13th Part 7 is, if you're paying attention to the timeline, technically that movie was set in the future. That movie was set in either 1999 or 2000 at least, which, assuming this movie is set a year after the events of Part 7, that would set this movie in either 2000 or 2001. Yet if you watch the movie, it is so clearly 1989. In fact, this might be the most 80s Friday the 13th movie, when again, the film technically is set in the future. Granted, in 1989, they had no idea what styles and fashions would be like in 2000 or 2001, but I don't think Rob Hedden, for a single second, was actually thinking about the timeline when he made this movie. I'm sure in his head, it was still set in 1989, even though, again, if we're following the timeline, this movie is set in the early 2000s at least. Now, all that being said, I actually like Friday the 13th Part 8. It's definitely my least favorite of the Paramount era of Friday the 13th, and it's definitely one of my least favorites in the entire franchise, but I still enjoy this movie on a certain level. I actually don't think it's a poorly made movie. It's not a very well-written movie, but I do think the film has a certain style to it, and it is at least a fun movie. Now, the plot of Friday the 13th Part 8 is it's set maybe a year or so after the events of Friday the 13th Part 7. Now, Part 7 ended where the spirit of Tina's father dragged Jason back into the lake. So this movie begins where Jason is once again chained up at the bottom of the lake. So in the beginning of the film, we follow this teenage couple who have taken their boat out onto Crystal Lake, and the boyfriend drops the anchor, and the anchor gets caught on an underwater cable, and ends up ripping the plastic lining on the cable, and the electricity goes into Jason's body, and Jason is once again resurrected. So Jason climbs onto the boat and kills the couple, and then for some reason decides to leave Crystal Lake, and apparently all this time Crystal Lake fed into a river that eventually led into the ocean, even though that was never established in any of the previous films, but whatever. But basically, either he drives the boat, even though I didn't know Jason knew how to drive a fucking boat, or the boat just drifts down the river, but somehow the boat ends up in this harbor. And it turns out that the Crystal Lake High School, their senior trip is actually a cruise to New York City. So Jason ends up climbing aboard the cruise ship, and it sets sail for Manhattan, and throughout the movie, Jason is killing all the passengers on the ship, and the story ultimately culminates in Jason causing the ship to sink, and only a handful of survivors making it off the ship, and eventually they make it to New York City, and despite the title of the movie, Jason doesn't actually end up in Manhattan till the last 20 minutes of the film. Now in the movie you have Jensen Daggett as Rennie, who is our final girl and the main protagonist of the film, and I actually like Rennie. I think she's a pretty likable lead, and throughout the movie she's having these hallucinations about Jason as a child, and I'm not gonna lie, I actually think the hallucination sequences in the film are actually pretty creepy. Now, it's never made quite clear whether these are just hallucinations, or if something supernatural is actually happening to Rennie, which wouldn't be beyond the realm of possibility because Jason is a zombie, so the supernatural does exist in this universe. Like, is she actually being haunted by Jason's spirit? Like, perhaps Jason's spirit is separate from his body, and his body is just soulless, or perhaps is actually possessed by some kind of an evil force, which would actually tie in with what's revealed about this character in Jason Goes to Hell. Or perhaps Jason's soul has two aspects. The part that's haunting Rennie represents the innocent child that Jason once was, and the part of his soul that's still in control of his body represents all the anger and rage over what was done to him, and I know I'm probably thinking about this way more than Rob Hedden was. And Jason in the movie is once again played by Kane Hodder, who played him in the previous film, and even though several actors have played this character, I think for a lot of people, Kane Hodder is the definitive Jason. You also have Peter Mark Richman as Charles McCulloch, who is Rennie's uncle and is the film's secondary antagonist, and he comes off as being overly protective of Rennie, but you realize that he's actually quite abusive towards her, and he is such a prick in this movie. He's almost cartoonishly evil at some points, which just adds to the entertainment factor, I think. Peter Mark Richman also played a very similar character in the episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, The Neutral Zone, so I guess playing douchebags was kind of this actor's thing. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire cast of the movie, but this movie does feature an early appearance from Kelly Hu, who would go on to become a relatively big actress. She would also show up in movies like X-Men 2 and The Scorpion King. Now, there's a scene in this movie during the section of the film where they're actually in Manhattan, where Jason chases Rennie and her boyfriend through a diner, and the chef tries to confront Jason, and then Jason throws the poor guy into a mirror. The reason I'm bringing this scene up is the actor playing the chef is Ken Kirzinger. I'm not sure if I'm saying his last name right, but he was the stunt coordinator for the movie, but he would actually go on to play Jason in Freddy vs. Jason. So yeah, Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, is an absurd movie. I'm not really gonna defend it, but I do enjoy this movie on a certain level. I think it's a fun time waster of a film, and if you and your friends want to have a bad movie night, this is not a bad movie to put in. And I mean, the title itself really does feel like something out of an SNL parody of Friday the 13th. And of course, despite the film's title, the majority of the film takes place on this cruise ship, which I actually don't think is a bad setting for a Friday the 13th movie, but honestly, the film is a major missed opportunity with both of its primary settings. Like, there's so much more you could have done with the cruise ship setting, and there's so much more you could have done with Manhattan, and the movie squanders both opportunities. And I understand a lot of that was because of budgetary constraints, so I can't really blame the movie that much. It also should be noted that most of the scenes that were supposed to be taking place in New York City were actually shot in Vancouver, Canada. The only parts of this movie that were actually shot in Manhattan were the scenes in Times Square and the scene where you see the Statue of Liberty. It also should be noted that this movie has one of the greatest moments in cinema history, where these punks are listening to music on their boombox, and Jason comes along and kicks the fucking boombox, and they go, "You are dead meat, slime bag!" And then he lifts up his mask, and they see his face, and they're like, "Whoa, whoa, it's cool, man, it's cool." And I actually like the song Darkest Side of the Night by Metropolis that plays in both the opening and end credits of the film. Now, it should be noted that this was the final Friday the 13th movie, at least until the 2009 reboot, to be produced by Paramount, because Paramount was never happy with this franchise. Despite the fact that these movies made them a ton of money, they were always kind of embarrassed by these films because these movies actually did not have a very good reputation at the time. And because this was the lowest grossing Friday the 13th movie at the time, Paramount basically wanted to wash their hands of this series, so they later sold the rights to New Line Cinema, and New Line Cinema produced the rest of the Friday the 13th sequels. Now, Rennie from this movie would later show up in the Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash comics. And despite the fact that this is considered to be one of the worst Friday the 13th movies, it has developed a bit of a cult following over the years, and this was actually a huge influence on Scream 6, which is also set in New York City, and in fact, one of the posters for Scream 6 is a direct ripoff of one of the posters for Friday the 13th Part 8. And there's also a scene in Scream 6 where one of the characters is watching this movie. Now, before I end this video, I just want to cut to a clip of my late friend Chris Mano giving his thoughts on Part 8. This was taken from a retrospective that we did on this franchise back in 2018.
Jason Takes Manhattan is one that I honestly, like, I can sit through a bad movie, and I don't know what it is about this one, but I just cannot sit through this movie, like, at all. I remember the first time I tried to sit through it, that was like 30 minutes in, and I was just like, I don't know what it is, but I can't stand this movie. I mean, the idea of putting him in Manhattan is great, especially for me as somebody who loves New York. But obviously the big problem is he spends like maybe 15 minutes in New York by the end of it, and most of it is on the cruise ship. Which they acknowledge. They're like, look, we wanted to do more with it, but it just didn't happen. But yeah, it's just, for me, it's strangely unwatchable. I think it feels very phoned in, especially in comparison to the other ones, which are just like silly slasher films. So it's tough to that's a tough nut to crack for me. I don't know what it is.
And here is my friend John's review of Part 8.
Here are my comments on Jason Takes Manhattan. After 7 movies of Jason being in the woods, they put on the Big Apple for a change-up. Well, I like the concept of Jason being in New York City, but the title is misleading. The movie takes place on a boat half of the movie, and they only shot one scene in New York City in Times Square. This is a movie I have mixed feelings about. When I first saw this movie, I didn't like it, but after reading about the movie's production budget problems, I've kind of looked at this movie in a different way. New York City is one of the most expensive places to shoot a movie. They shot parts of the movie in Canada because it was cheaper there. Then again, Canada is a lot cheaper to make movies instead of New York City or California. If Paramount had given this movie a proper budget and shot a good portion of this movie in New York City, well, I would not say it would have been a great movie, but it could have had some potential to be a decent, solid movie. I read they originally wanted to shoot scenes at Madison Square Garden, the Metropolitan Museum, Empire State Building, and Yankee Stadium. Being a fan of the New York Yankees that I am, that would have been cool and awesome to see Jason Voorhees interrupting a Yankee game, but I don't think George Steinbrenner, the former owner of the New York Yankees, would not have allowed Paramount to shoot a horror movie at Yankee Stadium. This movie should have been called Jason on a Boat, or heck, when they made this movie, they secretly called it Jason Takes Vancouver, which would have made more sense. The part when the two characters think they are safe and roaming around Times Square, it does have some nice visuals of Times Square showing how Times Square was so different back in the 80s compared to what I'm used to seeing in modern-day New York City today. When Rennie spots Jason, she runs away with her boyfriend Sean. I thought it was funny when Jason kicked a boombox for no reason. This was basically added for a little comedy. The gang are mad and upset and want to fight Jason. He takes his mask on, they're like, never mind, they run away. If you look closer in the background in Times Square, rarely I mention Easter eggs. They have a movie poster of Tim Burton's Batman 1989. This movie came out the same year as Batman 1989. The kills are not memorable as the previous movies, but again, the MPA did their usual job telling the editors to cut out the gore stuff. But I did like the part when Jason dumps the uncle in that green slime toxic waste, but he deserved it. Rennie's uncle was such an asshole. I also like the part when the boxer is punching Jason, and after throwing a lot of punches, he gets tired and fatigued. Then Jason hits him hard in the head and decapitates him without using a machete or any other blade. They originally wanted to shoot that scene in Madison Square Garden, but instead it was shot at some random building. Rennie's background story was cliche and was just meh. It's like, again, I've seen this done better in other movies, trying to face your fears. The chemistry between her and her boyfriend Sean was just so weak and flat. Fans complained and thought the ending in The New Blood was bad. This movie makes that ending look better. It's one of the weakest endings in the series, and it makes no sense. As Deadpool says, well, that's just lazy writing. I won't spoil it, give it a watch and prepare to be disappointed. It surprised me around this time when this movie came out, it's considered to be the longest runtime of the series, because usually these movies are usually over an hour and 30 minutes short. Our friend Chris Mano passed away last year. For someone who enjoyed bad movies, this was one bad movie he did not enjoy at all, and I can't remember why that is. He liked the concept Jason in New York City, which I agree with him on that one. Here's a little personal story. Back in 2019, we went on the Horror Sci-Fi Club field trip to New York City. I remember being at a store, seeing a t-shirt of Jason Takes Manhattan. I took a photo and sending to him a text picture joking, saying, your favorite movie. He responded back saying, laugh out loud, getting a kick out of it. A good concept with some potential, but sadly it was wasted. I don't hate or love this movie. I'm on the mixed fence on this movie. I can take it or leave it. I'll admit, the first half is boring when they are on the boat, and it semi picks up when they are in New York City. It's a misleading title that sounds cool, but when fans see it, they will be disappointed. I know because I was one of them and had the same reaction when I first saw this movie as a teenager. Sometimes occasionally I'll just watch clips on YouTube for the parts I liked in this movie. And sometimes I will suck it up and just watch the movie from start to finish.
And here are Joey's thoughts on Friday the 13th Part 8.
Yeah, Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, is another cool movie in the franchise. It was like something different in the series, like Halloween 3, and to me, like I think that was cool now too, Halloween 3, but I also think this is Part 8 of Friday the 13th because it's like I said before, the cruise ship, and then they went to New York, and it wasn't just like a camp scenery like the other movies. And what I also like about this movie is, since it takes place in New York, I like New York, so So that's why I like this movie too. Some of it, actually, I hear there was some scenes in New York, but there was some scenes that weren't in New York. I forgot what areas they said it was in, the ones that weren't in New York, but I found that out a long time after. But then the Deccan guy, the one that was like Crazy Ralph, that character is something like the Crazy Ralph from the other first two movies, which is really cool in a way because it's like it brings memories back from the first two movies. I guess you would say it's like one of those guilty pleasure movies, but like I say, to me, I really still enjoy it. Like I said before, it's something different in the series than just always having the campsite. And the effects, like I said before, I like the special effects the best, before the computers came out, before CGI, and this, in my opinion, really had good effects too. The way Kane Hodder looked and stuff, and it looked like real in some of the scenes and everything, and the makeup effects too. But yeah, Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. I recommend checking it out. I know it's not one of a lot of fans' favorites, but I still enjoyed it, and if you're one that doesn't mind, even though it's not like the other movies, then I would check it out.
And finally, here is my friend Jeremy giving his thoughts on Friday 8.
Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, isn't very good, and the main reason why that is because most of the movie doesn't take place in Manhattan. Most of the movie takes place on a cruise ship that sets sail from Crystal Lake. The film centers on a graduating high school class on a cruise ship heading to New York City. Unfortunately for them, Jason decides to tag along and, of course, murders them one by one. The main character is Rennie, who is trying to overcome her aquaphobia. She frequently sees visions of a young Jason, and I must say that in some of these visions, Jason looks pretty normal, despite the fact that he's supposed to be deformed. Although in others, he does look deformed, but whatever. Rennie seems to have a sort of psychic link to Jason. Like in the last two films, Jason is once again an indestructible zombie. Kane Hodder reprises the role of Jason, and he does a decent job. Jason's look in this movie is pretty gross because he always seems to be soaking wet. A character in the movie that I definitely want to mention is Dr. Charles Michaluk, played by Peter Mark Richman. He's one of the teachers chaperoning the trip and is also Rennie's uncle. He's always trying to stay in charge and is a total prick. Peter Mark Richman does a good job playing him, and I actually had the pleasure of writing to him a few times and getting some pictures signed. I also want to mention the character of Tamara Mason, played by Sharlene Martin. She's definitely the bitch of the movie, especially when she purposefully knocks Rennie into the water. She also blackmails Dr. Michaluk by tricking him into being filmed doing a scandalous act. She's definitely a very unsympathetic character. As I mentioned before, the movie mostly takes place on a cruise ship, which is very disappointing since the title makes you think that it'll take place mostly in Manhattan. Only the last 20 minutes are set in Manhattan, which is a total ripoff. I remember years ago I wrote a letter to the director of the movie, Rob Hedden. He was very nice and responded. The way Jason dies in this movie is also pretty ridiculous. He gets hit by a bunch of toxic waste, which somehow causes him to revert back into a little boy. Yeah, pretty ridiculous. So yeah, this is a pretty bad entry in the series. I can still watch it, but it's definitely a low point in the franchise.
So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. That was my review of Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, and my next movie review will be on Jason Goes to Hell, the final Friday.